Okay, I'm going to present some slides. We're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to hand over to Felix. We are pretty tight on time on today's webinar, so I'm going to try and power through this a bit. Pricing a project. And remember, my background is more to do with grants rather than tenders. There are different types of grant, and each one affects your approach to pricing. Sometimes you actually get a grant. These are incredibly rare. This is like somebody saying, here's 50,000 with a nice letter saying, congratulations, good luck, let us know how you get on. Very, very rare. Most of the time, what you get is a contract and something called an accountable grant. This is particularly for public money, for money from governments or UN agencies or so on. But contracts and accountable grants are the most common form of grant, and it really affects your approach to pricing, because often you have to make it very, very clear to them, to the donor, to whoever's paying, what is in the grant. You have to write a detailed budget. And for bigger grants, you might have to show a lot of evidence for why you reached that budget. So the other thing about, it's not so much with contracts, but particularly with accountable grants, it is not your money. A grant is your money. An accountable grant, it is not your money. If you don't spend it, you have to give it back. If you spend it on something that isn't in the budget, you aren't allowed to use the money for that. You have to give it back. If you spend it on something without the right evidence to support it, let's say you didn't get 3 quotes for the particular supplier, like an aeroplane ticket. Let's say you don't have the boarding pass. Sometimes these donors, they want the boarding pass of the flight to show that you got on board, or they want photographs from the event to show that you were there, that you actually took that flight. If you don't have the boarding pass, that money will be disallowed and you're not allowed to claim it. With accountable grants, the money is not yours. You can only spend the money if it's in the budget and if you have the right evidence. Now, of course, in conversation with the donor, and by conversation, I mean written conversation in emails to official email addresses, you can renegotiate how you spend that money. And in some grant agreements, it will say you're allowed a 10% variation, you know, between budget lines or budget categories or something. And then you don't have to worry about it. But it's always better to get written confirmation in official messages from the right people if you need to change things. With an accountable grant, it is not your money. And that's what most grants are from UN agencies or from government bodies. Another type of accountable grant is a milestone-based payment approach. That's what we have in the IMA project, and I have to say I quite like it. It's not as simple as a grant. You have to do regular reporting, but you don't have to show all of the evidence. You have to meet the requirements, but every month when we do a bill and we say we're ready for our next installment because we've reached these milestones, what they want to see is, say, the recordings of this webinar to show that we actually did it. They don't necessarily need to see the money that I'm being paid to produce these slides and to put the work together. They don't need to see my timesheet necessarily with a milestone-based payment. All they need to see is that the work has been done. They don't need all the details. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't keep good financial records, because what can happen is that at the end of the project, they can still come and check your books. They can still send an auditor, and they don't know that they're going to do this. It can just be randomly assigned by whoever's funding the fund. You would still need all the records in place. You still need 3 quotes. You still need the boarding passes, but you don't have to report on it to get paid. And so that can be a slightly easier approach than an accountable grant. Payment by results tends to be something that's used with the private sector, not with organizations like ours. I've never really experienced payment by results. And that basically means is, what payment by results is if you need to train 1,000 makers in your makerspace for a project, you get paid per maker. So there's an amount that's agreed up to a certain limit often, and you get paid a certain amount per result, basically. And again, it's a little bit like milestone payments, but it's a bit more granular. And to be honest, I've never really seen that. The other big effect on pricing is whether you're working on an innovation fund or a programmatic fund. The very vast majority of grants out there are programmatic, but occasionally you get innovation grants. Lots of makerspaces get innovation grants. With an innovation grant, in theory, it should be more flexible, and you should be, they should have a higher risk of risk tolerance. So you're allowed not to achieve your deliverables as long as you've tried, as long as you've got good documentation, whatever. It's meant to be, an innovation grant is meant to be an experiment. With programmatic grants, it can be quite a big problem if you don't do what you said you're going to do. And it's often very difficult to change what you're doing once the project has started. So pricing approaches in these different types of grants can be quite different, and it's worth bearing it in mind. An example of this might be that you need to prepare. I mean, I'm going to give an extreme example, but it's a real one. I had to do a budget once, which was for a 3-year project, and they wanted quotes, evidence for the budget, for what flights were going to cost at the end of the 3rd year for the final wrap-up workshop. So they wanted me to get quotes from airlines now for costs in, say, 3.5 years' time, because it's 6 months before the project begins, and then 3 years worth of project. But you needed quotes for those flights. Well, the airlines haven't even got schedules for those flights yet. So you had to sort of allow a lot of extra fat, as Felix used earlier, to make sure that you had, if the prices go up, as they have done with flights, my God, then you have the extra room in the budget to cover it. A little bit like what Anna was saying. Another consideration in all of this is how transparent do you need to be? Now, if it's an accountable grant, or if it's an accountable grant, you have to be 100% transparent. You can't hide anything. If it's a normal grant, sort of with no contract associated with very few terms and conditions, you don't necessarily need to be transparent. It doesn't mean you can't be ethical and you can muck about on your prices, because you've got an organization to run and you've got a reputation to uphold. And you've got, quite frankly, if you start mucking about with your budget, your colleagues in your organization will start to question you as well. I've seen that happen as well, where different attitudes in an organization towards how we should honor the donors' funds have caused challenges. But it does affect pricing. So for example, I'm going to be talking about indirect costs in a minute. If I'm going to be talking about, I'll give you an example to do with day rates. You might include the on costs, this desk, this computer, in the staff salary line, or you might have to list it out separately. So you could just have a vague amount for what you think it will cost to hire that person, the cost to the organization. So in the UK, we have the salary, we have employers' taxes, we have pensions, we have desks, we have electricity, we have computers, we have phone calls. In my project, in my budget for the Innovative Manufacturing in Africa project, that's just one line, one person, one line. But for some grants, particularly if it's an accountable grant, they want every single part of that spelled out in detail. And that affects pricing as well. Now, if you want to add in, if perhaps they're not adding on indirect costs as part of the grant, you might want to put indirect costs on every single line and spread it on, add it to the price of every single line, rather than having one line at the bottom to do it for you. Again, it depends on how transparent you need to be. This is a judgment call, unless it's an accountable grant where literally you have to do what they tell you. The golden rule: protect indirect costs and maximize direct costs. Under no circumstances should you be giving up indirect costs to fund direct costs of a project. So if you have a manager running the project and a member running the organization and a staff member running the project, so you have a project manager, Benita, and you have the chief executive of the organization, me, my time has to be included as a direct cost. My time for managing Benita has to be included as a direct cost. So if I spend 1 day a week managing Benita, I'm going to put that in as a direct cost. So protect indirect costs. What do you want to spend indirect costs on? None of your business. The donor does not get to know what you spend your indirect costs on. The answer is probably fundraising, but none of your business is the answer to donors on this. Everything else should be in direct costs. So an ideal indirect cost, if you're lucky, it will be a fixed amount or a fixed percentage. That's very rare. If you're lucky, it's a high percentage of a direct cost. So in our project, the Innovative Manufacturing in Africa project, it's not ideal. It's 7% for us. 7% is low. I have another project in the European Union where it's 25%. Universities, I've known universities charge 130% as indirect costs. So more than half the budget is spent on indirect costs, overheads. But 7% is incredibly low. It's one of the lowest rates around, apart from 0. And so what we've done is put lots of direct costs in instead. It's important what's written on the slide here. It's a percentage of the direct cost. It is never a percentage of the total. So if you have 10% indirect costs, I know I covered this in an earlier session. If you have 10% indirect costs on a $100,000 grant, the indirect costs are never $10,000. It is always 10% of the direct costs. So what it ends up looking like is like 92,000 as direct costs, 9.1, 9.2 thousand as indirect costs. Try not to fall into that trap, because the donor will come back to you and tell you off. So it's always less than you think when you look at the total amount of a grant and the indirect costs available. Now, you should always try to negotiate with your donor, and just as you would try to increase the margins, you have to know on a tender, you have to know your market, you have to know your client, how much margin, how much direct cost, indirect cost you can charge. Now, I said, if it's not ideal, if it's like 0% indirect cost on this particular grant, you can try to hide it. And I have no shame in saying that, because if they're saying 0% indirect costs, quite frankly, if it's a grant donor, they can go to hell. That's my attitude. I am so cross when I see that sometimes, when it says no indirect costs. Rubbish. Don't apply for the grant. It's ridiculous. And also write to them an email to tell them how wrong they are. But you could, if you wanted to proceed, try to hide it. And the way you do that is you put on every single line in the budget, you put 10%, you put 15%. You have the cost, add 15% on the line, so that now you can't do this with accountable grants, but you can do this with other forms of grant, where you can sort of spread the indirect costs across the direct costs, rather than having it one line on the bottom. But basically, just always try to negotiate. A little financial accounting detail. If it's an accountable grant of 100,000 and you've got 9.2 thousand in indirect costs, that will only be true if you spend the whole 100,000. If you spend half the direct costs, you can only charge half the indirect costs. So in most accountable grants, the indirect costs are calculated as you go. When you start the project, you have nothing in indirect costs on an accountable grant. If you spend $1,000, $10,000, then you will have $100 in direct costs, $1,000 in indirect costs on top of that. It's based on your spend in an accountable grant. And so do not make the mistake when the money turns up of moving that percentage out of the project, because the auditors will come along and give you grief, and you might have to pay it back. You have to wait till the end of the project for you to be able to charge all of the indirect costs. Here's an ideal situation. Now, you'll have all of the costs that Anna's talked about in the job. So you might have staff, you might have materials, you might have rent, whatever, all of the costs, the machines, you have all of those costs. On top of that, when I'm talking about maximizing direct costs, add all the managers. If you have a communications person, add a percentage of their time. If you have a web developer, add a percentage of their time. If you have fees for running a website, add a percentage of that, a contribution, as Anna called it, into it. Have a look, have a think about if you're making payments and your bank charges a fee, have a line in the budget for bank fees. It's often quite hard to do that elsewhere, but it's easier to have a dedicated line in the budget. It's a direct cost for doing bank fees. If your project has a steering committee, put the direct cost in there for like paying for their time, or for tea and coffee and refreshments when they meet. And you don't necessarily need to say tea and coffee and refreshments, you just say meeting costs. You can also put in contributions to your annual audit fees. And if you don't, and as we spoke about earlier in previous webinars, If you don't need an audit, it might be worth getting one anyway, just so that you could you have audited accounts to impress future donors with. This might be your chance, if it's a big enough grant, to pay for an audit that you don't really need, just so that you can have audited accounts and win a bigger grant next time around. Put in a percentage of your insurance, or the percentage of your finance software, or a percentage of, say, legal support. So one of the projects might be to register a new company or a new startup. Well, put in some direct costs there, a contribution towards the ongoing legal costs of your organization, perhaps. So these are things on this slide that might often get forgotten. Don't forget them. Put them in as direct costs in your pricing. Beware of any exclusions. If they say that you're not allowed to spend money on staff and not allowed to spend it on ongoing costs, find out what they mean by that. And then, if they say what we mean is we're not willing to pay any salaries, just say, well, then we're not applying for your funding then. Don't be daft. If they say no management costs, that is a real sin. Like, that is a terrible sin. Like, management is the thing you struggle to pay for in an organization. It's quite easy to pay the makerspace managers or the makerspace or the trainers' salaries. Quite hard to pay my salary as the one running the organization. Be careful about applying for grants that exclude that. And again, if you need to, put those costs into the line items as extra amounts on top of the cost of the item. So if you're buying a 3D printer, add on to the cost of that 3D printer the cost of the person's time to do the procurement for it, depending on the type of grant, if you can get away with it. So again, it's a little bit of hiding these costs in the budget. But basically just try to make sure there are no exclusions. I mean, there are regular exclusions like alcohol. You're not allowed to spend this money on alcohol. That's fine. We can all cope without a drink, but we can't cope without management. Beware match funding requirements. If the grant says this is a $150,000 grant, and you are required to, we will only pay $100,000 of it. You have to find the other 50,000. I mean, what are they doing? Why are they doing that? Find out why. Maybe you need to work with a corporate partner, and that the corporate partner should be putting some money in. There's literally no reason to do this other than the donor, in the case of a grant, doesn't trust you. And this is often a very insulting practice by donors, and it should be stopped. One way to stop it is just don't apply for the funds, and that can be hard if you're desperate. One way to meet a match funding requirement is using in-kind. So if you're running your makerspace and you have a match funding requirement and in-kind is allowed, then what about the cost of the existing machines in your space? That is an in-kind contribution. You're not buying new machines, but you're certainly using them, and you have to defray some of the cost of purchasing the machines of that original capital investment on this cost. That is an in-kind contribution to the match fund. So maybe if you've got, you need to find 50,000 matched funding, you could potentially get that 50,000 from the existing machines in your makerspace. Now, it depends how much evidence they want, but yeah, beware match funding requirements. On budgeting, this is more like a time thing. How much evidence do you have, and have you got the 3 quotes? This can be useful because when you come back in 3 years' time and the cost of flights has changed, like the example I gave before, then you can show that you need to change the budget, and you can speak to the donor, and they can sometimes help you out. Right, day rates. How much to charge for a person's time? questions are, how will you be doing the financial reporting? Sometimes you actually need to show, in the financial reporting, you need to show how, on your bank statement, how much was paid to that person. And recently I've heard of a grant where the person who's being paid also has to show their bank account to show that they have received it, which is madness. I've never seen that before. But they may never look. So it depends how you're doing your financial reporting. Do you charge the cost or do you charge the value? Now, quite frankly, my time is priceless. My time is priceless. But most of the time I charge the cost of what I cost and my time. But you can say, it's not, I have friends who work as consultants who will charge $3,000 a day because they can, because what they do is so valuable and so business critical that they can charge $3,000 a day. Now, they probably don't earn that, particularly if they're a big company, but that's like how they've priced it. So they think about the value of it. Do you go for high rates and less time or low rates and more time? I personally prefer the high rates and less time approach if there's an option. I would rather be charging $400 a day for 10 days than $100 a day for 40 days. And why would I do that? Because what if you get some follow-on funding? What if you get a repeat of the grant? You want to try and maintain that higher rate. I'll make that point again later. But, I would rather show the value of the work and have less time and just sort of find a way to spread the money, over a month or over 2 months. So maybe it's not 10 days. It maybe takes you 20 days and you have to spread it out a bit. Like, again, it's about how you do the financial reporting. And then you can include on costs and I'll talk about person months, but let's go to Anna first. Anna.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, I just wanted to add on to what you were saying about the preference for higher rates and less time. It's also important because it gives you much more flexibility. So if you then get other projects, you're able to charge some, you've got some time spare that you can charge to those other projects. So it just makes life a lot easier. Thanks. That's it.
Yeah. And if you do need to cut the budget at any point, you can potentially adjust them without feeling the pain personally too much. Including on costs. So the desk, the heating, the electricity. You probably don't have heating in Africa, but there you are. We need it in England. The taxes, the pension contributions, things like that. You can include that in the day rate. So in the case of the one budget line in this project, we've got the person's salary, the pension, the tax, the computer, the rent, the stationery. All of that is just a single line that says project manager and related costs. That's just one line. Person months. I love person months. I think they're a great approach. And oddly, it's one of the good things that European Union grants do. The person months basically allows you to include all the on costs. So you never have to say what a person gets paid. You only have to say what the price of that is, and you can include all the on costs in that. Most European grants only have 3 budget categories, which are staff, travel, and other. And because they're often so big and complicated projects, all they need to know is the person month rate. So you can come up with a person month rate of, let's say, it's going to cost $4,000 per person per month for this project. And you just use that one number across the entire project for the whole duration. And some people will be earning a hell of a lot less than that. And some of people, like the chief executives, for example, might be earning more than that, but it averages out to a single person month. Designing a person month cost, a person month charge, is something that the whole organization needs to be involved in. And that in itself is a bit of an art. It's essentially intended to be an average of the cost of employment of all of the people who might be working on the project, and all of the costs of all of those people working on the project, the on costs, the desk, the rent, the taxes, the pension. But it really, really simplifies a budget, because you can just put a person month in, and then you say, we need 5 people for 10 months, and you're done. So that's quite a nice approach, but you have to get pricing right on that, because if you get it wrong, it has big implications. Right, and then the last slide in my section, then we'll take a quick break. How many projects do you need to run your organization? I realized in my previous organization, Field Ready, we needed about 15 projects at once to be able to fund the chief executive, the website, the insurance, the communications person, to basically fill all of the costs of running the organization. We needed about 15 projects of about $500,000 each to basically fill all the gaps. So I'm going to give you a personal example. My salary is £70,000 a year, which means that I cost my organization here at the Internet of Production. It's different at distributed manufacturing, but at the Internet of Production, I would cost 80 to 85,000 a year because of taxes and pensions and things, and rent. I have 21,000 coming in from the Innovative Manufacturing in Africa project to my personal bank account. I have £25,000 coming in this year from the Make project, and I have about 5,000 coming in from UNICEF, although I don't think that will ever actually turn up. Which means, even though my salary is 70,000 a year, I'm actually only going to have 51,000 a year, 51,000 coming in. I have a gap in my personal salary and a cost gap for the organization as well. So 19,000, 30 or 34,000 overall cost. I need to find that money from somewhere to plug that gap. Now, being able to get so far with only 3 projects is really good. If I had a couple of more projects this year, and time's running out because it's October, we'd be sailing. The cost of me to this organization would be covered. But at the moment, that isn't happening. So what do? Well, this is when you can use your indirect costs, and you can fill some of those indirect costs unrestricted. You can spend them on what you like. And I might use some of those indirect costs to top up my salary this year. I'm also open to donations. If any of you want to donate to the Internet of Production, I'm also open to that. But again, it's unrestricted funds. So this is why indirect costs can be really, really important, because it helps you fill gaps. And you need them, and you need to protect them. Just so that you know, in my case, I am a variable cost. If there isn't money to pay me, I don't get paid, but I still do the work. I become a volunteer. Why? Because it's my organization, and I want to make sure that I do this kind of work. That rule doesn't apply to anyone else in the organization. I'm the last to get paid, and I make sure that other people are fully compensated for their time. But in my case, it is perfectly possible in the UK to live off 51,000 a year. That is still an excellent salary. In a charity in the UK, that is still an excellent salary. The 70k is the price, and the 51k is the cost for us this year when it comes to my salary. So there's a little bit of how many projects you need to fill the gap. There's a little bit of pricing. There's a little bit of costing in there, and then it basically comes all comes together in the next question, which is pricing in an organization.